We're going to start a new topic today in Hegyonei Halacha from Rabbi Mirsky Shlita, because we're in a sort of not here, not there position in terms of the Hebrew calendar. We're certainly not ready for his next chapter following Hanukkah, which is Tu B'Shvat. You know, it's been a while till we get to Tu B'Shvat. And after that, he has Purim, which of course is going to be much later on. We have two Adars this year. So let's take a week or two to study Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. If you have the pages, we're going to begin on page 234. And there are two great events in terms of sanctifying Kiddush Eretz Yisrael. One is the event of Kibush Yoshua. Yoshua crosses the Jordan after the battle with Sichon. And Yoshua conquers the land over a period of 7 years of battle and then a 7-year period of settlement. That is what's called Kedusha Rishona, as opposed to Kedusha Shnia. Kedusha Rishona lasts until the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the exile. And then 70 years later, Ezra establishes Kedusha Shnia, and he brings with him tens of thousands of Jews to set up the second Commonwealth. There's a fundamental difference, as we'll see as we go along, between the first Kiddush, that of Yoshua, and the second, that of Ezra. To what halachos is Kiddush relevant? What bearing does it have in the world, the constellation of halacha? First and foremost, Trumos and Masros. And basically what we're talking about now is Kedushas Karka, which means mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz. Those mitzvos apply in Eretz Yisrael when the land is sanctified. So for example, Yoshua comes in, conquers the land, they settle the land, and they are chayav in Trumos and Masros. How so? Because Yoshua effectuates a Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael. And that Kiddush generates Trumas and Maasros. Truma given to the Kohen, of course, Maser given to the Levi. There's also Maser Sheni, which has to be taken up to Yerushalayim to eat in the Kedusha. And there are many other mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz. There are Shemitah and Yovel. There are mitzvahs like Matanos Levyonim, like Leket, Shikhan, Peah. In a word, there's a whole slew, a whole constellation of mitzvahs that depend upon Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And during the first Kedusha, the first Commonwealth, from the time of Kibush Yoshua until Nebuchadnezzar and his armies exiled the Jewish people and destroyed the Mikdash, for that period of time, over 4 centuries, there was a sanctification to the land of Eretz Yisrael. That sanctity generated all the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz. Now we have Churban. 70 years later, we have a second Kiddush, another process of sanctifying the land of Israel, and that begins with Ezra at the time of what we call Aliyah Shnia. In English, we call it the second Commonwealth. That's going to last with the building of the Beis HaMikdash for a period of 4 centuries and more. And during that time, all the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz are active. They are all da'oraisa. And during the period of time of David HaMelech, we're going to see that there's an expansion even beyond the borders of Eretz Yisrael into what's called Aram Tzova. And those areas which are in the north are sanctified, but only midrabanan, not on a d'oraisa level. Now the question is, what is the status of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael in the future? Is it, quote, Kidsha l'shaita v'kidsha l'asid lavo, or is it Kidsha l'shaita v'lo kidsha l'asid lavo? And this is a gigantic sugya, which you'll see here on the first of your pages, 234. And it's annotated in footnote number 2, Yevamos Pei Beis, a machlokes Tanoim and Amoraim. One school of thought says Kidshel L'Shaita v'Kidshel Lavo. Once the sanctification takes place and it's activated, it is generated for all time. And the other opinion is that Kidshel L'Shaita v'lo Kidshel Lavo. If we accept the second opinion, then the first Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael will last until the Churban and the Golus. At that point, let's take, for example, the 70 years in between the first Kiddush and the second. The land of Israel is lacking in its sanctity. What does that mean? Don't raise the possibility, Chas v'shalom, that it's not Eretz Yisrael. It's still Eretz Yisrael. It still is the land that is possessed by the Jewish people. And we want to settle in that land, and we want to be uplifted by the land itself. But it's lacking that Kedusha, because we're holding now Kidshel L'Shaita v'lo Kidshel Lavo. And with the Churban and the exile, the first Kiddush is gone. During that 70 years, there's no Chiyuv v'Tshuvas of Maasros on a Doraisa level. And that's Kidshel L'Shaita v'lo Kidshel Lavo. The Rambam at the end of Hilchos Beis HaBechira paskins that Kedusha Rishona Kidshel L'Shaita v'lo Kidshel Lavo. And therefore, as I said in my introduction, Ezra is going to have to replace the first Kedusha and effectuate a second process of Kiddush, of sanctifying the land, because the Kedusha Rishona is Kidshel L'Shaita v'lo Kidshel Lavo. And therefore, as we said before, on a Dorais level, there's no Chiyuv Trumas and Maasros between the destruction and the exile of the first Kedusha and the beginning of the second Kedusha. We need the second Kedusha, the Makadesh of Ezra, in order to sanctify the land, because the original Kedusha is Batel, it's completely null and void, because Lo Kidshel Lavo, that's the Rambam's psak. However, the Rambam paskins that Kedusha Shniya, the second Kiddush, that of Ezra, is Kidshel L'Shaita v'Kidshel Lavo, and it's sanctified for all eternity. So that today, the land of Israel will generate a Chiyuv, Trumos, Umaisros, and all the mitzvah Tzulis Baretz, D'Oraisa, because of Kidshel L'Shaita v'Kidshel Lavo, with regard to the Kedusha Shniya, as opposed to Kedusha. However, the plot grows thicker, because not only are we in the dark as to why the first Kiddush was only L'Shaita v'lo L'Yasid Lavo, whereas the second was Kidshel L'Shaita v'Kidshel Lavo. That is enough of a challenging, mind-boggling question. But moreover, we have a different issue. What about the sanctity of the Makom HaMikdash, of Yerushalayim and Migdash? And the Rambam paskins that the Kiddush of Migdash, even during the first Kiddush, at the time of David and Shlomo, even that was Kidshel L'Shaita v'Kidshel Lavo. So you have two things going on over here. You have, during the period of Bayis Rishon, on the one hand, an issue about Eretz Yisrael and whether its sanctity exists and will it exist forever. And another issue you have about the Kedusha of Yerushalayim and the Makom HaMikdash. For example, shlamim could be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. Would that halacha apply liyasid lavo, even after the Churban, even after the exile? And the Rambam says yes. Why? The Rambam gives us a clue in one phrase at the end of Hilchos Beis HaBechira. Shashchina eino b'teil l'yolam. The Kedusha of Migdash and Yerushalayim is the Kedusha of Shechina. And Shechina eino b'teil l'yolam means from the moment that Shlomo HaMelech built the first bayis, the Shechina now rests in the bayis and it never leaves. Even if the bayis is physically destroyed, there's no bayis there, the four walls, the mechitzos are gone. Nevertheless, that kiddush is liyasid lavo It exists perpetually, indefinitely, in all times, over the course of all of history. And that's despite the fact that the Rambam paskins Kedusha Rishona Kidsha L'Shaita below Kidsha L'Yosef. So as far as Eretz Yisrael is concerned, after the Churban, there is an empty period of time as far as the mitzvahs hatluis ba'aretz. What I mean by empty is that there's no kiddush, and the mitzvahs hanoagos ba'aretz hatluis b'Eretz Yisrael are not noagos; they don't apply because we paskin, says the Rambam, kedusha rishona kidsha l'shaita v'lo kidsha l'osel. But the Mikdash and Yerushalayim will still generate and maintain their own kedusha, even though all of Eretz Yisrael around Yerushalayim is no longer sanctified after the Churban of Bayis Rishon. And this you'll see on page 234, about 5 lines up from the bottom. The Ram writes, Kedushas Migdash v'Yerushalayim biglal hashchina hashruya bahem u'shchina eina b'teila liola. Once the Shechina rests on the abode of the Shechina, what we call the Migdash as the abode of the Shechina, it never leaves. And that's the Makadesh of Yerushalayim and Migdash. Shekein darshu chachamim, a Gemara at the end of Tainis, vashimosi es Migdash shechem. There's a paradox in this pasuk. Vashimosi means that God is telling us that the Migdash will be destroyed, but then Mikdash Shechem, he's calling it a Mikdash. It's no longer a Mikdash if it's Hashimosi. And the Gemara darshins, Afal Pisha Shomimim, Bikdushasam Hemomdim, even if they're in shambles, total destruction. Nevertheless, the Kedusha still exists. And this, by the way, has repercussions even today in terms of what you're allowed or not allowed to do in the Makom HaMikdash. Who can enter into the Makom HaMikdash? You might argue, what's the issue? I mean, there is no Mikdash. You have a location without 4 walls, without a bias. But the answer is, the Makadesh that generates the Kedusha is Shechina. It's not the 4 walls. And Shechina ain't a b'teila liyol. That is the Rambam Shita. Then the Rambam at the end of this page, quoted here, addresses the issue of, I'll just read it to you. He says, We're talking about the balance of Eretz Yisrael outside of the boundaries of Yerushalayim. Then we're not talking about Shechina. We're talking about Kibush Rabin, because David HaMelech, when he conquered some of the lands up north outside the bounds of Eretz Yisrael, that's called Kibush Yachid. Not for us now. It's a whole other discussion. But the wars and the battles that we found that Yoshua and his armies fought, that was Kibush Rabin. And Kibush Rabin is not identical with Shechina. And the nafkamina is that according to the Rambam Shita, the Shechina, which is the Makadesh of Yerushalayim and the Makom HaMikdash, that Kedusha Shechina is Eina B'Teila Liola. There's nothing that you could possibly do under the sky, under the stars, that would ever undermine that sanctity. But the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael outside of Yerushalayim, that was engendered by Kibush Rabin. And Kibush Rabin is meaningful as long as the Jewish people are living and possessing the land. But once they go out to Golus, the entire Kibush Rabin enterprise is gone with the wind, completely undermined. Because Kibush means that I have sovereign control over the land. That's what Kibush is. I control the land. Once we're sent into exile, we don't control the land. Hence, The kibush rabbim that sanctified the land is gone. It's history. And therefore, the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz are at best, in the best case scenario, are derabbanan, but certainly not Torahs. Now we get to the Kedusha Shniya, that of Ezra. 70 years pass. According to the Rambam, Eretz Yisrael is now lacking its Kedusha. As far as the mitzvah hatluyos ba'aretz comes Ezra with a reenactment of Kiddush, a brand new Kiddush to sanctify the land and replace the old Kiddush, which was completely nullified. Is there any need for Ezra to sanctify the Mikdash and Yerushalayim? No need. We don't need Ezra for that. That is a result of the original Kiddush of Yerushalayim, which the Rambam holds Kitchel Shaita, Vikitchel Wasalom. And it's not Batel. That's the Shekhinah. Now the Rambam uses a very particular term, which he singles out to justify his ruling, his psak, that Kedusha Shniya, that of Ezra, is Kitchel Shaita Vikitchel Yosef. He doesn't have to justify the fact that Yerushalayim and Mikdash are sanctified. That was a Kiddush that from the get-go was Kitchel Shaita Vikitchel Yosef. But as far as Eretz Yisrael proper, the mitzvah hatluyos ba'aretz, we saw already that Kitchel Shaita v'lo Kitchel Yosef. And the Jewish people go into exile, and the land forfeits its Kedusha. So there are no mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz on the Doraisa. Why then is the second Kedusha a Makadesh l'shaito vilyasid lavo, even after Churban Bayesheni, and we are sent into this bitter, long Golus that we're suffering from to this day. Thousands of years of Golus, and we're still not sure where the end of it is. And those who say that the end of it is when the right-wing parties will come back into political control, I have news for you. We can't rely not on the left nor on the right. As my father used to always quote the pasuk before Kriyas Yamsuf, before Shiras Hayom, it says, Hamayim lahem choma miyamin umismol. And he used to interpret it that the choma here are the chomos that protect the Jewish people from the yamin and from the small. Because Hamayim lahem choma al tikri choma, the Gemara says elachema. That's the wrath and the anger of the left and the right. So if you think you're a socialist and the Jews should be socialists, then the right wing are going to blame you for creating anarchy in the society. And if you think that you're a right winger, then the left winger is going to say you Jews are a bunch of fascists. There'll always be an excuse. So let's not fool ourselves. But the second Kiddush, says the Rambam, is going to exist and sustain itself forever and ever. Kidsha l'shaita v'kidsha l'yasin lavo. Why? Because of one word, hazah. The Rambam drops a bomb. What's the difference between the first sanctification at the hands of Yoshua and his armies and the second sanctification at the hands of Ezra and the Ole Aliyah Shniya? The first Kiddush is a Kiddush of Kibush. Kibush meaning to conquer the land. The very conquering of the land is what activates and generates the Kiddush. Once that Kibush, that conquering of the land, the dominion of the Jewish people of the land is gone with Churban and with Golus, then the Kiddush, the original Kiddush, is gone. But the second Kiddush, that of Ezra, was not Kiddush. God, in his good, benevolent chesed, put into the hearts of the leaders of Persia, etc., to invite the Jewish people to come back, return to the land, and build the Beis HaMikdash. That's called Kiddush al Yidei Chazakim. not Kiddush al yedei kibush, but rather Chazak. Says the Rambam Leficha on the second line of page 235, Kol Makom Shechziku Bo Ole Bavel. Right? Where did the Aliyah, the waves of Olim, where were they coming from? Not from Toronto. They were coming from Bavel, which was the greatest spiritual center of the Jewish life at that time. And the Babylonian Jews were joining Ezra, coming from Bavel to settle in Eretz Yisrael. Lo b'kibush kidsha. They did not sanctify the land through kibush. Ela b'chazaka shechziku ba. They settled the land. They possessed the land. They enjoyed the land. That was a national, communal act of sanctifying the land of Kiddush. Lefichach, kol makom shechziku bo, ole bavel v'niskacha, Kedushas Ezra, Kedushas Shniya, who mekudesh hayom. This is the Rambam talking in 1150, 1190, in Cairo. And the Rambam is telling you that today, Trumos or Maestros and all the mitzvahs Baretz are, in effect, are activated on Doraisa because Kidshol L'Shaitim and Kidshol Asidlavo. And why? Because it was a Makom Shechziku Bo Ole Bavel V'nis Kadesh B'Kedushas Ezra Shniya. And therefore it's Kadesh even today. Afal Pisha Nilkach HaOretz Mimenu, even though the land was robbed away from us. The Shvius and the Maisros and the Trumos, etc., all Minat Torah, because Kidshol L'Shaitim, the Kidshol Yosef. And now the Kesef Mishnah asks two questions on the round. Number one, and Kedushas Yehoshua did not include Chazaka. I mean, what happened? After the 7 years of Kibush, it was 7 years of Yeshiva, what we would call in modern Hebrew, Yashvut. And the Jews settled the land of Israel. Ishtachas Teino, Vishtachas Gafno, and we have 12 Shvatim, each one got their chelek. How could the Rambam tell me that the first Kiddush of Yoshua is null and void as far as Eretz Yisrael is concerned? Don't lose focus as far as Yerushalayim and Mikdash. That's a whole different story. But as far as Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael is concerned, it's gone. Why? There was no Chazaka? There was no settlement? The Jews did not settle the land? On the contrary, they settled the land in mass numbers, Shishim Ribu. Compared to Ezra, I don't remember, what was the number in Ezra? 42,000, whatever the number was? A fraction. So how could the Rambam tell me that the second Kiddush of of Ezra is still active and still valid because of Chazaka? There's Chazaka even in the first Kiddush, that of Yoshua. Certainly Yoshua's Kiddush did not exclude Chazaka. That's ridiculous. And secondly, says the Kesef Mishnah, I don't understand the logic of the Rambam. Just because the second Kiddush was through Chazaka, therefore the Kedusha is gone? When? At the time that we get exiled? No, says the Rambam, it's not gone. Why not? Chazaka. Chazaka means we possess the land. We settle the land. Well, I got news for you. We were sent into a bitter gulf, a long exile. Why isn't that exile mevatel Chazaka? Why doesn't it undermine and neutralize the Chazaka? So we have two kashas in the Kesef Mishnah. Let's just review them. Fantastic kasha. I don't know which is stronger than the other. We'll ask in the opposite order that we present. First question is, why should Chazaka make any difference if that Chazaka is completely undermined and null and void? It's neutralized by the Churban and by the Golos. And secondly, why are you robbing Yoshua's Kiddush of the element of Chazaka? Very rare that the Kesef Mishnah who is the protector of the Rambam, should leave it as it's origin. I was happy to see that Rav Mirsky Shlita in this Sefer Hegyonei Halacha is aware and excited about my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik addressing this question and offering a solution, a new, brand new interpretation of the Rambam. And Rav Soloveitchik redefines the concept of chazak. There are two types of forces in physics. It's not Rav Soloveitchik. There's centrifugal, where there's a point in the middle and the energy force shoots out from the hub until it covers the entire area, the entire surface. Then there's an opposite process where the energy force is in a surrounding shield, almost like a protective circle, and gradually moves towards the center. So one is center and out, and the other is out and then to the center. How does Kiddush work? What is the center? The center is Yerushalayim, and the center of the center is the Beis HaMikdash. Does the Kiddush, the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael, begin with Mikdash and then spread out, what we call Hispashtus HaKedusha? If there's anyone here who remembers the sugya at the beginning of Kedushas, I think it's on Daf Daled, maybe Daf Hey, Daf Daled, called Hispashtus HaKedusha. Pashta Kula HaKedusha B'Kuli. You remember that sugya? He was Mekadosh half a woman, and he gets a full woman for the price, for half price. Or he had an animal and he was Magdish it to Mizbeach. He decided he's going to be Magdish the regel, only the thigh of the animal, is his pashta Kedusha B'Kula. So one way of understanding Kiddush Eretz Yisrael is that we begin from the core, which is Yerushalayim and Mikdash, that's the center, and it moves out to sanctify the entire land through a process called Hispashtus HaKedusha. But then there's another method. And we begin from the outer periphery, and we move from the periphery, step by step, inch by inch, until we finally reach the center, coming from all sides, until we move into the center. What is Kiddush, as far as Eretz Yisrael is concerned? Says Rav Soloveitchik, herein lies the fundamental difference between the first Kiddush, that of Yoshua, and the second, that of Ezra. In a typical Tzvei Dinim style, there are two Dinim in Kiddush, in sanctifying Eretz Yisrael. Yoshua begins sanctifying the land from the outskirts, from the periphery, moving towards the center, towards Yerushalayim. The Jews defeat Sichon, they cross the Yarden, Yoshua is leading the armies, and of course you know that there was Bittul Torah over there, that's today's daf, but whatever it is, that's Yoshua, that's a Kiddush that begins from the outskirts. Not so Ezra. Kiddush al Yidei Ezra, Kedusha Shniya, begins with the Beis HaMikdash. And I'll prove it to you. On page 236, in the main paragraph, second line. Vayakumu Roshei Avos liYehuda uBinyamin v'Kohanim v'Levim lechol ha'ir halokim esrucho lalos livnos esbeis Hashem b'Yerushalayim v'chol svivoseim chazku b'yadeim v'ele b'nei HaMedina ha'olam etc. v'yashuvu liYerushalayim. The Kiddush process begins in the Chelek of Yehuda and Binyamin. They own the territory of the Beis HaMikdash, and it moves out from there. It starts in Yerushalayim, in Migdash. The Migdash is rebuilt, the second Migdash is now erected, and from there we move out. But going back to the previous page, as far as Yoshua is concerned, it's a whole different story. And that is what the Rambam calls kibush. What does he mean by kibush? Kibush means Yoshua boel Eretz vehischil lichbosh osa migvulot seah. Yoshua begins with kibush on the outer boundaries of Yerushalayim, of Eretz Yisrael. Aloch v'kadesh. Is kibusho, is mikoach mitzvahs milchama. Kibush means mitzvahs milchama. How is Yoshua going to sanctify the land? Through fulfillment of the mitzvah of milchama, which is kibush. And that mitzvah requires of him to first take care of the peripheries and then gradually peel away layer for layer until he reaches Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash, to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. V'el Yerushalayim HaMikdash lo ba shelo higiu el HaMikdash ela b'mei David u'Shlomo. Fascinating comment that the popular Aliyah Eretz Yisrael and to come into the Beis HaMikdash was during the period of David and Shlomo. We can only hope each and every one of us that our great ancestors were part of that movement towards Mikdash, gravitate towards the Mikdash during the period of David and Shlomo in order to fulfill the mitzvah of kibush. The last rung on the ladder, the last stage in mitzvah's kibush is Yerushalayim and Mikdash. But what about Ezra? That's on page 236. Ezra comes on Aliyah from Bavel, bringing a whole lot of Jews with him. And Balo Tchila El Yerushalayim v'el Beis HaMikdash. He begins with Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. Misham, from the center, from Yerushalayim, Yatzu b'chziko b'svivos Yerushalayim b'shar makomos. They left, embarked, and departed from the holy Yerushalayim and Migdash, and then they moved out to the surrounding areas. I was very impressed recently, by the way, somebody who bought an apartment, a flat in Beit Shemesh. Beit Shemesh is very popular, the new neighborhood. It's about a half-hour drive, maybe 40 minutes from Yerushalayim. And he told me that he's being Mekayim the mitzvah of Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael. So I said, there's something paradoxical going on here. He's leaving Yerushalayim, selling his house in Yerushalayim and flipping it for a house in Beit Shemesh. It's getting twice the space. But that's called Aliyah Eretz Yisrael, to leave Yerushalayim. But the answer is right here. Because as of Aliyah Shniya of Ezra, Aliyah and Hityashvut in Eretz Yisrael always begins from Yerushalayim moving out to extend the Kedusha to the peripheries of the land of Israel. And that's called Chazakah. To start in Yerushalayim, we're not talking about Mulchama then. We're not talking about Kibush. We're starting in Yerushalayim and we're moving out to settle the entire land of Israel. And Natlu Imayim Kedushas HaMikdash. Wow. We've always wondered, where is the source for Kedushas Eretz Yisrael? Where does it emanate from? Every Kedusha has to begin somewhere. The Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael begins in the Migdash. And from the Migdash, we can extend that Kedusha to all of Eretz Yisrael. Again, it will never be the same Kedusha as the original, as the source, as Yerushalayim and Migdash. But nevertheless, it will be sanctified. All of Eretz Yisrael is sanctified through this process of chazaka, which in a sense extends the Kedusha of Yerushalayim to all of Eretz Yisrael. And this is called Hispashtus HaKedusha. Remember I spoke to you before about Hispashtus. This is Hispashtus, which is, by the way, a halachic term. Now you might ask the following question, but it's we already know the answer. How can you extend the Kedusha of Yerushalayim to all of Eretz Yisrael if we hold that Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaitim Alo Kitchel Asalo? So when the armies of the Nebuchadnezzar uprooted the Jewish people, at that point the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael was gone. So how could Ezra hope to draw the Kedusha from Yerushalayim? But the answer is, as we said before, Kedusha Rishona, as far as Yerushalayim, is a Kedusha Shechina, Kitchel Shaita Ve'las and Lavo, and it is a Kedusha which is never Betela, Ki Ein HaShechina Betela Liol. So in a certain sense, you could say that Ezra was standing on the shoulders of the greats that came before him during Bayis Rishon, who sanctified Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael with a sanctity that is eternal, that is a Kedusha Olamus. Ask yourself the following question. If you were to place these two Kedushas on a scale, Kedusha Rishona, which was generated by Yoshua, and Kedusha Shniya, generated by Ezra. I think if you would ask for a knee-jerk response, you would certainly say that Kedusha Rishona was greater and superior to Kedusha Shniya. I mean, this was the original Kedusha. This is what Hashem had in mind when he commanded Yoshua to cross the Yarden and conquer the land. Comes out according to this, it's just the opposite. Kedusha Shniya is greater than Kedusha Rishona because Kedusha Rishona is a Kedusha of Kibush. It's a Kedusha that begins with the peripheries when we cross the boundaries in Eretz Yisrael and we conquer piecemeal every segment of Eretz Yisrael. But Kedusha Shniya is basically Kedushas Migdash because the Kedusha begins with Migdash and expands and is mispashe through all Eretz Yisrael. And the Rambam Paskins so that second Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is Kitchel Shaita V'Kitchel Asalo, and therefore is still binding even in our time. Joe?
The Gemara, which talks about the Shechina leaving the Mikdash, right? Talks about it went from one place to another, it kept on going farther and farther away, and then going up to Shemayim, right? So like it
in Tainus, right? In the Masechta Tainus.
I don't remember where it was. But it basically says that it left. I mean, the Gemara says that the Shechina left. And that was after the second base of Mikdash. It doesn't say that it had.
But the Kiddush, the sanctification of the Shechina, changes a location, a place on the face of the globe in an irreversible way. We may have closer relationships to Shechina, further distant, long distance phone calls, to get to the Shechina. But the Kiddush of Shechina, in and of itself, is never button. Okay. Now I want to mention to you here in this essay in the Hegyonei Halacha, the Meshech Chacham, which is on the bottom of page 236. And the reason.
Just one question. Doesn't that mean that the Kedusha goes back actually to David and Shlomo, like to the base of Mikdash being established? And it's not Ezra. As Ezra just took that and was mispazer it outside of the city outside Yerushalayim, so to speak.
Absolutely.
So it's not Ezra did not. It's not totally in whether the Shekhinah is actually there or not, or whether the Beis Hamikdash is even there. It's just that Kedusha that they made is
once that Kedusha was effectuated and generated by Shekhinah, then we can always, because it's Liyasid Lava, we can always draw from that Kedusha and expand it throughout the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. But Ner Simcha is very relevant to us now, not only because it's an alternative to the Rav Soloveitchik approach to the two Kedushos and the difference between them, but also it's relevant particularly to us to answer our question as to which Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is greater. We came to the conclusion based on Rav Soloveitchik that it's the second Kedusha, because that's the Kedusha of Migdash. But Meir Simcha has a principle, a new klal, if you will, about the mechanics of not only Kedusha, but hafkas Kedusha, removing Kedusha. And he has a very interesting theory. It's almost counterintuitive. He says that there are different levels of Kedusha. We'll call one Kedusha Chamura. That's a very intense, heavy Kedusha. And then we have a lower Kedusha, which is called a Kedusha Kala, with a Kuf. In Hafkas Kedusha, paradoxically, Rabbi Simcha claims he has a proof for this, it's easier to be mafkia a Kedusha Chamura than to remove and undermine a Kedusha Kala. Counterintuitive. He gives a proof, the halacha of a kohenes. Kohenes means a bas kohen. And the sugya in Masechta Bechoros compares and contrasts a bas kohen with a bas levi. In the case of a bas kohen, who's allowed to eat kodshim and truma and so forth, nivala liznus, pasla psulo achilas kodshim. In the case of a levia, shenivala liznus, lo nifsala me'achilas masa. What's going on? Says Rabbi Simcha, hu adid, v'hu atah. The Kedusha of Kahuna is greater than that of the Kedusha of Levia. And it's much easier to undermine the Kedusha Chamura than it is to undermine the Kedusha Kala. Therefore, says Rabbi Simcha, Kedusha Rishona was greater than Kedusha Shniya. But that's why it's easier to be mafkia the Kedusha, because it's a Kedusha Chamura. All you need is a simple, very easy, you blow it away and you can, with one breath of air, you can undermine the Kedusha because it's a Kedusha Chamura. A Kedusha Chamura needs all the conditions, operating at 100%. How many cylinders are there in your car? How many horsepower do you have? All the horsepower that you can have. And therefore, once the Goyim conquered the land of Israel, in Kedusha Rishona, then that's mafkia the Kedusha. But Kedusha Shniya was a secondary Kedusha. And the reason for that is because the Aron wasn't there. The Afutzo Ivecha Mipanecha, Vayibin So Aron. And that generates what he calls a Kedusha Kala, a relatively lower ebb echelon Kedusha, such that the Goyim cannot be mafkia that Kedusha. Because when it comes to Kedusha Kala, it's more difficult to be mafkia the Kedusha. In any event, bottom line, before we go on to page 237, just make a note of it, that according to Rabbi Simcha Midvinz, there's no question, it's undeniable, that the first Kedusha is greater than that of the second Kedusha. And he puts both in the perspective of Migdash, but whereas in the first Kedusha, The Mikdash included the Aron and many other features. The Bayis Sheni did not include the Aron, and therefore its Kedusha was a Kedusha Kala. And now he drops the bomb that it's counterintuitive, and that Kedusha, which is a Kedusha Chamura, will be subject to bittul, and we can void it through the kibush of the Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, but not a Kedusha Kala. Unbelievable. It's like from one extreme to the other.
Berzin, the other perspective on the lumdus of why Kedusha Chamura should be easier to
because
be
to achieve a Kedusha Chamura, you have to come from a very high place. And it's got to be pure Kedusha without any admixture of blemishes, of contamination. The Goyim come and they contaminate the land, and we can't maintain and retain that high level of intense Kedusha.
It answers a question I was going to ask also about the fact that the second Kedusha was really under the dominion of a foreign power. In other words, but Klal Yisrael never really got the power over Eretz Yisrael. So it's like it's a subservient type of Kedusha anyway from that perspective.
Right. Whereas again, according to the Rav, Kibush and Migdash are two separate concepts. So Eretz Yisrael in the first round was sanctified independent of Migdash, whereas the second Kiddush, that of Ezra, was all an extension of Yerushalayim, which makes it a superior Kedusha that cannot be undermined because Hashchina ain't a B'Teilu Lil.
But Rav Meir is saying that the stronger Kedusha doesn't become a weaker Kedusha. He's saying that the stronger Kedusha gets completely wiped out.
Correct. If the conditions that are necessary to engender that Kedusha are violated, then its pure desecration undermines the Kedusha. It's an all or nothing proposition. And now we're up to page 237, which I think is the last page that you have. No, you have more than that. You have the whole article. On page 237, based on a sefer called Meir Einei Chachamim, we have a very fascinating preposition. And that is that when Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu was not zocher to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, and during his supplications, he said, wait a minute, if you're not letting me enter the land, oh God, at least let me be buried in the land. After all, Yosef HaTzadik, I worked very hard to bring his bones to Kvura in Eretz Yisrael. And Hashem says, wait a second, why didn't you identify with your people when the Bnos Yisrael said, each Mitzri Hitzilonim, and you said nothing? This is one example of Shtika Kodadam. In the American culture that I was brought up with, the credo was mind your own business. Did you ever hear that? So somebody enters into a train, a public subway, and starts harassing people. And all of a sudden, everyone's reading their newspaper very intently because mind your own business. But the Torah says, Al Talmud Al Damriach. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, mind your own business. These women thought I was an Ish Mitzri. I look like an Ish Mitzri. I just run away from Mitzrayim. But Yosef, he says, Ganov Gunavti the Eretz HaIvri. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, he who identifies with the land will be buried in the land. You didn't identify with the land. you're not buried in the land. So the Meir Einain asks the following question. I don't understand. How could Moshe be taken to task for not identifying with the land? The land was not given to the Jewish people until Yoshua, when he crossed the Jordan and conquered the land. Moshe Rabbeinu was before that. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu held to task for not identifying with his land? What do you mean his land? He came from Mitzrayim. He is now in Midian. He never made it to the land. At least Yosef, was born in Eretz Canaan for the first 17 years of his life. And he was taka stolen and got over Gunati, the Eretz HaImrid. Moshe should identify with the land? The answer is, this is a beautiful thesis. That there's a way of identifying with the land that has nothing to do with actually possessing the land. And the proof is with Avram Avinu, Ela Oretz Asher Lechacha La Oretz Asher Ek. Chazal say, Ela Oretz Asher Ek. Go and settle the land, Avram Avinu. Even before we are a nation, we don't even have a national existence. It couldn't emerge at that point. But identify with the land, settle in the land. So that Eretz Yisrael is a land that generates what we call Aliyah Eretz Yisrael, settling the land even before we have the mitzvah, even before we have a nation. And if that be the case, then Moshe Rabbeinu should have identified with the land way before Kibush Eretz Yisrael. It had nothing to do with Kibush Eretz Yisrael. And if you take a look on page 238, the third line, Kevod Shekvar Nitztave Avram V'Zaro Leishev Be'eretz Yisrael. Therefore, any other place on the face of the earth that the descendants of Avram settle in, it's always going to be a yeshivas aroi. Our permanent yeshiva could only be in Eretz Yisrael. And that begins with and dates back to the time of Avram Avinu. And now we add another element into this beautiful equation. When we identify a person with a land, with a makom, with a place on the earth, we identify him with a makom kavua. He may be temporarily living in Clanton Park, but that's only on a temporary basis. We identify him with his makom kavua. And there's no makom kavua for a Jew, not even in Uganda, other than Eretz Yisrael. And I'm sure Bruce would agree with me. By the way, David Spiegel, if you can possibly link up with Bruce so he can get the Marmakomas, we'll work that out technically. In any event, getting back to this, Ein Adam Nikra El Al Shem Makom Kavua. Moshe Rabbeinu, from the time of Avram Avinu, was taken to task. He should have been identified as Makom, not as Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is all just a temporary basis, a stopping point, a stopping station on the way. He should have identified his makom with Eretz Yisrael. And the Rogatsham of all people, Haskin Halacha L'Mais, a Shaila and Hilchas Shvuos, oaths, very chomor. Anything about Shvuah is always based on this principle. That a makom kavua, even from the time of Avram Avinu, before the nation emerged, before the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael, a makom kavua is Eretz Yisrael. And that applies to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was not born in Eretz Yisrael. He didn't live in Eretz Yisrael. He wasn't buried in Eretz Yisrael. Yet his makom was Eretz Yisrael. In what context did the Rogatchover offer this psak? Fascinating. We're going to turn back the clock to Turkey, to Palestine under the Turks before the British came in. And the Turks came out with a decree. And they said the following: only Jews who are born in Eretz Yisrael can stay. All the others have to be exiled, immediately thrown out of the land. But the Turks said, we don't have birth certificates, and therefore no Jew has a way of proving that he was born in the land. We're going to require that any Jew who claims that he was born in the land of Israel will take an oath, a shvuah. And they wanted a halachically binding oath. And there were many Jews who didn't know what to do. They were not born in the land of Israel. Would they be allowed to take such a shvuah? It's a false oath. To swear that you were born in Eretz Yisrael when you were not? And they sent the Shaila to the Rogatchover. And the Rogatchover writes, it's on the bottom of page 238, Mutter, they can take such an oath. Ayin super stuff, ayin hey. Very typical of the Rogatchover. He doesn't give you explanations, tell you where to look up the answer. What is it that he found on Ksubas ayin hey? The Gemara in Ksubas darshins a pasuk in the 87th chapter of Tehillim. Uletzion ye omer, ish ve'ish yulad bo. Ish ve'ish? What's ish ve'ish? And we have psukim like anshe or anoshim. We have psukim ish ve'ish. What's ish ve'ish? So the Gemara says in Ksubas daf ayin hey, what is ish ve'ish? Ki v'shnei anoshim dibra kos. Ish ve'ish refers to two categories of individuals. Echad nolad b'tzion, v'echad nolad chutz mitzion. V'al shneim omar kasuv. Again, let's read the pasuk again. Uletzion ye omar ish ve'ish yulad ba. The second ish is referring to someone who was not born in Eretz Yisrael, and yet he is described in this pasuk in Tehillim as Yulad Ba. Well, I ask, how could that be? And the answer is, we don't judge a person's halaga, his birthplace, by a place that he happens to have been born in, but rather in a place that he identifies with. That's what Sion is all about. Sion, even if you weren't born there, you're considered Yolda B'Tzion. Ish ve'ish yulad ba. Says the Rogatchover. Even if you weren't born in Eretz Yisrael, you're considered yulad ba because you identify with the land. And you realize that that's your makom kavua, wherever you are on the face of the globe, that's only on a temporary basis. And if you ask me, was the Rogatchover a great Zionist? Was he part of the Zionist enterprise? I don't think so. He was a Lubavitcher in some sense. You know, the Rebbe, you can call him Shlita or Al Vasham, whatever you choose. And the Rebbe got his smicha from the Rogatchover. We're not talking about, Rav Soloveitchik says he jumped ship. He came from an Aguda background and he decided to join the Mizrahi. You remember the story, he compares it to Yosef versus his brother, the whole story. But you can't say that about the Rogatchover. And I'm telling you, Rav Osai, this entire presentation here, which is brand new to me, on page 238, should be publicly recited on a Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration. It's like a Zionist speech over here coming from the Rogatchover, all based on the Gemara, Ayin, Subas, Ayin Hey. That's all he writes. And you can take a shvuah, an oath that you were born in Zion, and you weren't born in Zion. It's not a false oath. And that explains why Moshe Rabbeinu was taken to task. True, he was never born, he never lived in Eretz Canaan, but he should identify with Eretz Canaan. That's your permanent place for every single Jew from the time of Lech Lecha Me'aretz Lecha El HaMakom Asher. Now we're up to page 239, but I see that the clock is working against us at this point. I just want to say the following. As far as, I want to go through the balance of this article with you. We're almost towards the end. And after that, and I'm mentioning this so David, if you can make a mental note of it in case whatever happens, and I get confused, page 244, which is the very next article, if we can get that out for next week. But right now, on page 239, which is the next page that we're up, we're at a very fascinating junction because there are two mitzvahs in the Torah, or I should say more precisely, two episodes or commitments that the Jewish people made out of a sense of pizzizus. Pizzizus means impulsive decision or action without thinking about the repercussions. And one of those two took place at Har Sinai, when we declared as a nation, Na'aseh v'nishma. Tremendous pizzizus. We didn't even know what was included in that commitment of Taryag mitzvahs. But there's a Gemara in Ksubos, not the Gemara that we mentioned before, that introduces the same concept of pizzizus with regard to living in Eretz Yisrael. And the entire enterprise of living in Eretz Yisrael is like Limud Torah, a matter of pizzizus. So I say to you, my friends, as we close this discussion about Kedushas Eretz, if you're thinking about living in Eretz Yisrael, and that's your Makom Kavua, no matter where you are, don't expect that the decision could be rational. It could be well thought out, planned. I got my pension plan, I got my house here, I'm buying here, I invested here. Everything is worked out to the T. It just doesn't happen. And I can tell you story after story. What do you say, Joe?
They have to let us in. They're shutting it down again.
Right. Yeah, I hope that'll change soon. There is one possible solution, though. I think, don't quote me on this because I don't know if what I'm saying is correct legally, but I think if you declare Aliyah in Toronto, they'll let you come into Eretz Yisrael. You'll get yourself a Tudat Zahut, we call it a Tudi Zudi, and you'll be able to land in the land. You'll have to go to quarantine. I don't know if it's 3 days, 7 days, 14 days. It changes like the clock from one hour to the other. Somebody just came from America and they put him into quarantine for 3 days. My wife came in 2 weeks ago. She got 3 days, but whatever. It's just. So that's the bottom line. Pizzizus. You have to be a puzzle. And I always tell my students, if you want to look in Shulchan Aruch and find out whether or not you have to make Aliyah according to the Shulchan Aruch, come to me, I'll find you a heter. But it's got to be something, it's got to be an element of irrational, of pizzizus. I wish you all a great week. And Shkaya, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Rav.
Thank you.